At this point, I'd like to read you something by Marx from the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, 1852. Marx writes, "Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living." So according to Marx in this passage, which is quite a radical passage, Marx is saying that we do not, as human beings, think about the society we wish to create and then go about trying to create that society. Quite the contrary. We're born into a particular kind of society, and then we have to make sense of that society. And this is the fundamental role, according to Marx, that is played by art. Art helps us live in the society into which we're born by making that condition tolerable, by making it reasonable, and by making it seem justifiable and legitimate. So the consolatory power of art, which is the power of art to console and to ease pain, is fundamentally tied up with the relationship between art and power, which is to say the relationship between art and the status quo. So in this sense, what Marx is talking about when he talks about the difference between the base and the superstructure is the relationship between speaking and thinking, which is to say between text, poetry, novel, drama, song, and power within a society. So what exactly is a base and what exactly is a superstructure? Well, according to Marx, the base is another word for what he calls the generalized mode of production. The generalized mode of production is the way a society makes food, clothes, puts up its houses. Through history, according to Marx, generalized modes of production have developed and changed. For example, the earliest modes of production are, say, hunter-gatherer society. But then with the arrival of cities and state governments, you have wars, and with wars came slavery. So the next mode of production is the slave mode of production. In the slave mode production, you find that you have kings, and the normal function of poets, as far as we can tell, in the slave mode of production, was to celebrate the power of the kings and the aristocrats. In ancient Egypt, for instance, we have wall upon wall of hieroglyphics celebrating the deeds of great kings. And almost nothing is left of the folk traditions which we know must have existed. What do I mean by folk traditions? In every society we look at today, we find not only the official poetry of the state, but also itinerant musicians and poets who are functioning in a tribal context, singing songs of love and grief, songs that speak to tribal and village existence, which predates the state. Now, it makes sense to talk about those texts as ideological vis-à-vis the tribal condition, but they're not ideological vis-à-vis the state. The slave mode of production reached its height in ancient Rome, where we know from records one woman, when she died, liberated thousands upon thousands of her slaves because she said she'd become a Christian. This is really quite amazing, that one person could own thousands of other human beings. It's also very interesting that in the ancient world we find almost nothing. No one speaks out against slavery. Even Jesus Christ has nothing to say about slavery. Pretty much the only person who ever comments about slavery is Seneca, who says that it behoves us to treat our slaves well. Even Seneca isn't opposed to slavery. This is also a point about Marx's theory of ideology. Ideology is different from rhetoric slightly because it's not just what is said, but the premises of what is said. It's not just an argument that somebody puts forward, but it's the very assumptions of the argument that is put forward. In other words, everything that we take for granted, which makes us think that society has to be the way it is, that it cannot be otherwise, and that our position within that society makes sense and is in some degree just. As in the 2nd century AD, as Rome no longer waged war, fewer and fewer slaves came into the empire, and slavery collapsed. It was replaced by wage labour. Marx explains this by saying, slavery did not collapse in the ancient world because people preached against slavery, because artists said slavery was wrong. Slavery collapsed in the ancient world because Rome was no longer waging successful wars, and because it makes more sense from an economic point of view to employ a worker than to use a slave. Because if your slave gets sick or dies, you're out of pocket. You take a loss. But if a worker gets sick or dies, you just replace the worker, because the worker is a cog in the machine.